is a professor in computer science. He is one of our ethics fellows in the whole engineering curriculum that we support. So let's welcome him, and he can start on his presentation, which I'm totally excited about.
Thank you, Liz. So Tracy just mentioned about National Cybersecurity Center. I understand that cybersecurity is a big focus on campus in general. Yang and myself, we were hired just last year, and we were, two of the new faculty who had a cybersecurity focus just for computer science department. And we actually have another faculty, an endowed faculty coming in as well. So the campus is pushing for cybersecurity. Today I want to talk about cybersecurity. Talk about the relevance of cybersecurity when it comes to ethics. Many parts of this talk actually goes back to why I applied for a DFEI fellowship. At the application I did talk about cybersecurity relevance, but I also kind of had a chance to reflect on how I was teaching some of the introductory computer security courses. And there are students who actually are familiar or who know about computer security techniques beforehand, but many of the students, it was their first time to actually get a formal education in computer security. A couple of them were nervous. They were actually talking to me. Can I do this? With my project. With the actual hands-on, or is that too invasive with the legacy system? And many of them, I think it can be more of an ethical question. So that's a bit about the background or the motivation for this presentation. I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Sang-Yoon Chang. I'm an assistant professor at the computer science department here at UCCS. And today I'd like to talk about computer security and ethics. So very briefly, just wanted to introduce myself. Here's the research fields that I'm interested in. I'm interested in the intersection of computer security, applied crypto, computer network and wireless communication. I'm actually an ECE, electrical and computer engineering major by training. And from here, you go downward, and that tends to be more ECE. You go upward, and that tends to be more computer science. One more thing, so I have courses on Coursera. Coursera is a massive open online course platform, scalable online courses. So if anybody, engineer or non-engineer, are interested in applied cryptography, then please do check them out. So I was an EC major by training, but more and more, these days I'm starting to focus more on computer security. And as mentioned earlier, I was actually hired for my computer security profile. Because of my background in computer security, I teach computer security courses in the CS department here. And here are some of the courses that I teach. CS 4910, Introduction to Computer Security, senior level course. Again, this is probably one of the first courses that the students take to actually get a formal education for computer security. There are students who did some, more like computer security related projects for hobbies, for example, but this is probably the first time that they take a formal education on computer security. I also teach 4920, 5920 applied cryptography. Again, there's an online version of that as well, collaborating with NSA and Coursera. CS 5960 is a wireless and embedded system security course. It's a new course that I first launched last semester, and we're going to talk about a case study, and that case study is very relevant to the 5960. So all of these courses are senior level course, 4,000 level, or like a graduate level courses, but all of them are related to computer security. So I first wanted to talk about the nature of computer security. There's a cliche that says, a robber and a policeman are basically the two sides of the same coin, and that applies to computer security here as well. We, as an educator of computer security or researchers of a computer security, we do try to focus on defense, but it is absolutely critical to have an understanding of the offense. to actually design the defense systems as well. And because of that, when we teach or when we research in cybersecurity or computer security, we naturally learn concepts, techniques, and there are also many tools that can also be used for offense. And this is when the students start to get a bit nervous when they're doing their projects. In computer security, we actually have in the hacker community, we actually have terms for this. White hat is the good guys. Black hat is typically the bad guys. And there can also be entities who can have both hats. They can be white hat or black hat, depending on the context. So let me give you a bit of a context or more examples corresponding to people who are gray hats. One very famous example is Robert Morris, and people are familiar with computer worms here. So computer worm is a software that propagates across different computers, and Robert Morris actually is widely credited to be the first person who invented computer worm. So that was Morris worm in 1988, and because of that, he was a graduate student in Cornell, and he was doing an experiment with lab at MIT, and it actually propagated outside of that collaboration. And because of that, he actually was the first person to get persecuted by any type of digital site security or cybersecurity law. He was the first person to get any type of sentence because of digital activities. Because of that, he was sentenced to community service. However, after he served the service and he graduated, he actually became a professor at MIT because of the academic or intellectual contribution that he made. But this is the case, where he was first perceived as a criminal, and then his academic or intellectual contribution actually received credit. Another example of a gray hat person is a more recent example. It's a hacker, Marcus Hutchins, and he was actually considered a hero because he stopped a ransomware software called WannaCry. But recently he got involved in this finance transaction, and he just got arrested. This happened like a couple months ago. So depending on the context, you can easily become a good guy or a bad guy, but you do, as proficient computer security experts, do have the skills to become both. So as we are learning those skills, as the students are learning those skills, I felt that ethics was important. So the focus among the courses that I'm teaching, there are two courses that actually have course projects. And these course projects, all the course projects have some hands-on components to them. So they're taking what the knowledge that they have been learning in the classes and trying to apply them in real setting. Here are some of the examples of the course projects: keystroke logger, keyboard logger, wireless. Wireless being slightly more sophisticated, but this can be actually really used for offense. As a matter of fact, when I was doing my graduate studies in UIUC, we actually had an incident with a keystroke logger. There are some students who actually launched the keystroke logger on a public computer lab, and they were taking, the TA's credentials. Professors, we have our own credentials, we have our own computers, but they were actually taking the credentials of the TAs, and in that way they were able to control like Blackboard equivalent to what we have here. So we have students who are working on keystroke logger, mobile malware, people who are developing the mobile apps, fake base station. And feel free to interrupt me. I'd love to just talk in the middle of it.
How to do that.
Oh yeah.
So you actually teach them how this is done?
Yeah.
Is that ethical?
Well, we do. They do learn the concepts for it. For the keystroke logger, the scary thing is there are already open source tools out there. So like the current, I have like two teams who are working on keystroke logger right now, and they already identified like a couple of open source tools. And one of the group is actually downloading and installing those different tools and comparing them. So to launch these attacks, it's a matter of downloading and installing. So it's not a matter of just developing your own code. They're more analyzing, like what the state of the art or those open source tools are currently doing. Other project, there's a fake base station project. So, when you connect to a wireless, you connect to a Wi-Fi network. What if you set up a fake network? Then, that fake base station can, become, eavesdrop on your communication and become a man-in-the-middle attacker. So a group is focused on fake base station. We do have, projects with regarding network intrusion, and the defense of that can be detection. Denial of service is also a popular project. Denial of service, just flooding the victim target until it goes down. Like I think CNN was probably one of the first example that actually went through a denial of service to actually hack the web page down. Bluetooth low energy is dropping. Bluetooth low energy is becoming critical because we're looking at IoT these days. And Bluetooth low energy is one of the front runner of the communication protocols that are being used for IoT devices, database security, reading private information, as well as actively deleting records of databases. That's also being looked at. Game console hack. There are people working on game GDD majors, so they do have like game focused degree. So they are interested in looking at game consoles. Drone control security, taking a radio and trying to hijack the control of the drone, like unmanned aerial vehicles or UAVs and so on. But these course projects are actual course projects. Some of the examples that are being done by the students in the class that I just mentioned. And you can envision how these can actually be utilized for offense as well. I do emphasize defense, so even with some of these projects that are more offense focused, I tell them to actually incorporate some defense side of it. If you cannot incorporate it hands-on, then at least like have a discussion about what are the potential countermeasures to these offenses. So here I wanted to talk about what the difference last year and this year. I was hired last year in August, so this was my first semester teaching this course. And here's what happened. So I knew that ethics was important even then. So I didn't want to incorporate ethics lecture as a part of the course. What I did was I had that lecture at the end of the course. At that time, it seemed like a good idea. I have all the concepts, technology, the technical materials up front, and then I have the non-computer science topic at the end. And that lecture was mostly based on a textbook chapter. So many of the concepts that I was talking about actually apply generally in computer science. And in computer science department, we also have a required course, CS 3050, that is required, and this is an ethical course. But I looked at so there was a big overlap with CS 3050. So this happened then. And then, I applied for DFEI, I got accepted, I'm very grateful. Actually, this is supposed to say fall 2017. So this is 1 year from now, and this is current. So after DFEI, I modified the lecture. Well, first of all, I didn't want, last year I realized that the students were getting confused, a little bit nervous as they were doing their course projects. So I actually moved the lecture earlier. As opposed to being at the tail end of the course, I moved it as much as early as possible, and this was after they kind of got started with their project. And there was also significant adaptation from the textbook chapter. Now I'm starting to have a greater focus on responsible practice when you do computer security research or investigation, as well as responsible disclosure. And it also discussed about other general legal enforcement and ethical guidelines for computing artifacts. In this talk, I'd like to focus on responsible disclosure or best practice and responsible disclosure. So responsible disclosure, we do research, we do projects, and many of the projects involve finding a security vulnerability and patching that. That's the majority of the projects that we work on. And when you find a vulnerability, especially if it's unknown vulnerability, if it's a new or zero-day exploit, then you would want to disclose that to the relevant parties before you actually publish that. So this is a common practice, among computer security researchers, and I wanted to share that with the students early on, especially if they want to pursue their career in cybersecurity. So that's a gist of what responsible disclosure is, and there are a set of rules by ad hoc committee for responsible computing. This like an engineering group that actually provides ethical guidelines. In the DSEI principles, it probably focus on more on accountability and viability, but we do have a set of ethical guidelines for computing artifacts. It focuses more on development, deployment, and the use of computing artifacts or computing products. And a big part of this, the lecture that I actually gave out, was to use a case study. And more specifically, it's a case study regarding remote car vehicle hacking. And here's what I did. I actually started off with the ethics principles, and I used DSEI ethics principles. And we actually went over them, and I wanted them to be consciously trying to map how each of the principles actually were applied in the case study of that car hacking. And we also talked about how some of those situations, there can be dilemma scenarios, and you would want to have a strong notion of these principles in order for you to apply them. Edward Snowden's case comes into mind, but there can be some of the gray boundary areas. And in those cases, you would want to have strong notions of these principles and be able to apply them and build your case or some reasoning behind the decisions or actions that you're taking in those dilemma scenarios. So again, going back to the case study, I did go through the principles. I wanted them to consciously map it to the case study. So I do want to talk about the case study and build a little context. The case study that I gave out to the students was remote car hacking. So this is taking over car control remotely. So remotely, no physical contact, and more specifically, I'm focusing on over the internet connection. So it's not like line of sight connection. And there are two contrasting cases. One was done by Charlie Miller, Chris Valasek in 2015. The other academics, San Diego, UC San Diego, and UW, University of Washington in 2010. And in this talk, I'm going to talk about the incidents in reverse chronological order, and then we'll talk about the reflections and some of the disclosure decisions that they made for these two cases in 2015 and 2010. So here's what happened in 2015. Researchers, Charlie Miller and Chris Valasek, they actually came up with a remote attack that actually uses the internet, more specifically the Sprint network connection, and they actually hacked a car, hacked a Chrysler Jeep. And as a result, Chrysler recalled 1.4 million cars, and Miller and Chris Valasek also actually published the codes and the details, and there were copycat attacks, for example, on BMW and Tesla and so on. I would like to show you a short video. We'll probably stop it in the midpoint, but this it's an entertaining video with a lot of visual, so I do think that it's going to be a attention grabber and a good start for this context building. There's a couple more minutes on that video, but just wanted to give you context about what happened in 2015. This was widely publicized. It actually went beyond the computer security community. People who were doing engineering, people who were doing computer science, even people outside of engineering were talking about this. And it was also published at Black Hat, which is a hacker conference in Las Vegas, annual hacker conference in Las Vegas. So I want to talk about what happened before 2015. Before 2015, they mentioned it, but they also did similar attack in 2013. In 2013, it was no longer a guy in the basement, using the internet to hack the car, but it was actually them physically connecting their laptop on the car to control the car. This was actually when they presented this, they mentioned that the car vendors were nonchalant about this attack because it actually requires a physical connection to the car itself, which does increase the attacker barrier. So people were lukewarm about it. Yes.
So which port can I connect my computer to my car and control it?
That's an excellent. That's a nice one. That's a question.
Oh, she's gonna try.
I think it'll be the USB. I'm not exactly sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
You would buy a car.
Yeah, you don't get to sit in my car. Actually, I did give you a right or two, so no more. Not with your laptop. Okay. So they did do that in a more of a physical contact required attack in 2013. And they also mention about these academic papers that happened in 2010 and 2011. In 2010, 2011, it turns out that researchers in UC San Diego and University of Washington, Yoshi Kano and Stefan Svaj's group, they actually did do a comprehensive analysis on these threats. It talked about physical contact-based attack, line-of-sight communication-based attack, as well as over-the-internet-based attacks. This actually happened in 2010, 2011. Many of the vulnerabilities were there. And they mostly relied on demo as well. The reason, they had some demo videos that they were showing on these academic conferences as well. However, Charlie Miller and Chris Valasek did point out that they didn't really disclose the vendors, the models of the cars, and there were no code or details to reproduce the work. And this is kind of odd to us. I mean, in our community, in the computer science community, everything is becoming more open source, more open code, and even with academic conferences, reproducibility is of high value. They did have similar attacks in 2010, 2011. However, there was very limited disclosure in the details of their work. There was also an article soon after that Wired video that I showed you by the same journalist, Andy Greenberg, who actually did talk about Miller, Valasek's work and the UC San Diego UW's work. They talked about the second bullet. Miller and Valasek, when that event happened, the impact was swift and explosive. In contrast, there was a same group of researchers who did that earlier and did that in 2010, 2011. And they did mention that it's far ahead of its time, and it took GM 5 years to fix. It turns out that the vendor of the previous attack, the academic attack, was actually being pointed out by GM. So the researchers in the academia, they actually do talk about their reflection on what happened in 2010 versus 2015. And Stefan Savage from UC San Diego talks about that in this conference called Enigma. And Enigma is it's more the hacker conferences, but it has a more of an academic or industrial flavor. It's a very new conference, a couple of years old, but the organizers are both from academia as well as the organizer of those hacker conferences. So there's a bit of a community venue issue as well. When we do have these type of reflections, do we have the necessary venue to actually talk about them? And this seems to be one of them. Savage actually came out and talked about their reflection on the car hack incidents. So their goal was to provide knowledge about problems, which is common among us. We like to produce new knowledge, new information, and create some incentives to act on that knowledge. However, do so in a way that minimizes real harm. And he also talked about how there were very little capacity to deal with such attack back in 2010, 2011. And then he has a positive spin about the actual impacts that he made. it was not as explosive or as eye-opening or as publicized as the other attack in 2015, but their work actually did make an impact. So this was the first time when they actually publicly acknowledged who the vendor was. This was GM. But before then, it was more like off-the-channel type of knowledge. This was the first time that he disclosed it, and GM, as a response, because of the communication with these groups and GM, they actually get pretty serious about cybersecurity. They hired a cybersecurity officer, and there's 100 employees working just for cybersecurity for GM. Society of Automotive Engineering, which is the standardization body, they actually have a standardization for cybersecurity. NHTSA, National Traffic Highway Safety Administration, it's a government sector. They actually have a lab, that focuses on cybersecurity as well. So they did make an impact, but it's just not as publicized. One thing that I want to capture was the contrast of of their disclosure approaches between the two events. So in 2015, widely publicized, it spilled over the computer security community. In 2010, however, the researchers consciously made an effort to limit their disclosure, even going against the more trend of the open source and reproducibility trend of computer science. So why did they limit the disclosure in 2010? The timing is critical. 2010 versus 2015, it's a 5 years difference. It's a big gap, for computer science. And back in 2010, this was really a novel threat. There was nobody, there was no adversary, and therefore, there was no incentive or there was no corresponding supply to actually support such cybersecurity effort. Hiring people, and the incident in 2010 actually started building toward that. Another aspect of it is the notion of information technology versus operational technology. Before this event and before the DARPA challenge, which is a completely separate event, car vehicle used to be considered as an operational technology. It was not. It was only fairly recently when we started viewing car as a computer with wheels. But beforehand, it was not a computer. It was just a car. It was more like But because of that, IT versus OT differences, the product of car can actually be more complex in terms of manufacturing the car. Many more vendors, companies, being a part of that car product. Actually, back in Asia, I was working on securing a train system, and I understand how many different parties are involved in making a train and operating it. There's an operator, there's an integrator, and that integrator has layers of different vendors who are actually producing products so that the system integrator can integrate them. But that complexity also had it very difficult for the OT sector to perform updates or to consider cybersecurity. You can think about the nuclear facilities still using very old OS Windows, Windows 2000, but very OS systems. It's not as dynamically updating as the sectors in IT. Another factor that limited their disclosure was the fact that this actually has a physical implication. It's not just putting down a website. It's not, but it actually can have physical implication that can lead to person safety. So that also actually factored in to the limited disclosure in 2010. That was the case study, and then the students and I we had a discussion, and then we had a brief exercise, talking about how each of these principles can be applied to the case study in 2010, the limited disclosure in 2015, in the more coordinated disclosure. And we did that exercise with the students. It was great, there were a lot of interactions. So this is the last slide that I have. I did want to establish the relevance in computer security, and this particular responsible disclosure, I think it's a little bit more unique in computer security as well. So I wanted to shed a slightly different view of how ethics can be applicable in computer security. In computer security, there can be many gray area, dilemma areas, and I do think that establishing these principles is very important when you make decisions or actions whenever those gray area happens. So thank you very much for your attention. I forgot to thank DFDI, Liz and Tracy and others, but I'm very grateful about this opportunity. Thank you for your attention. Yes.
I have a quick question. So the rule of law principle, we know that the laws in the computer world are drastically far behind the technology.
Mm-hmm.
That it's just lagging. And so how did the students react to that? I mean, what was their kind of take on, that's all old laws, it doesn't apply, or are they engaged to think about what that new law might want to look like? Or can you touch on that kind of correlation of antiquated law and your profession?
That's a great point. So I'm not really too familiar with the legal aspect of it. We do talk about it. We do show some cases of what happened with these people, but the actual law, it mostly follows on just common sense. Yeah.
It's not a trick question.
I really hope that I can share more insights than that. But yeah.
Okay, great, thanks.
Has there been any publication or discussion where you've shown examples where you can remotely hijack a car and hijack the controls of the car? Has anything ever been stated where you can remotely hijack other things like a ship? Because I wondered, remember there was that accident where the ship crashed? I think it was I don't remember, it was this year, in the summertime, I believe. It was a Navy ship that crashed. I think it was either.
Oh, the Argus?
Yeah, Panama or something, where it
There's two of
crashed.
them.
Two of them in Japan.
There were
South China Seas.
There were actually
And I
two
wondered
cases.
if two vessels crashed into each other, the thought had crossed my mind that someone had hacked the controls and was controlling that ship remotely.
The Navy disclosed that that was human error, that they didn't have proper training. For
Yeah, well, I don't necessarily believe
Yeah, me neither.
that. So I just wondered if
For the
the
record.
technology exists where we can remotely hijack a car, then to me that says the technology exists where we can remotely hijack a train, an airplane, a ship, any other vehicle that has the capability, like you said, it goes through the entertainment systems.
Mhm.
But those other systems must have systems that you could come in through.
So
I'll give you an example. Over across the valley at CyberWorks at USAPA, they have a complete lab environment which basically simulates an entire city and community.
Mhm.
And the answer to your question is yes, they can hack aircraft, yes, they can track
Okay,
hack
that's all right.
trains.
I'm just pretty sure. Okay.
Currently, they can take over other remotely controlled aircraft from other countries because
Mhm.
some of it's very simple. One of the most secure facilities is actually up at FE1, the nuclear technology, and the reason for that is they use 7x7 floppy disks, and they're not connected to any outside source. So because of the antiquated nature of their technology, they've become more secure.
That's where we're
rather
driving
than,
old cars.
than less secure. So yeah, there is. In fact, they run tours from time to time over if you're interested in that.
let's comment on that as well. So in principle, I definitely agree. If there's a system like that, and I would imagine that it's going to be, I would definitely agree, that it's very likely that people can hack it.
Mhm.
Is there a publication I'm not really aware of, any publication that actually hacks the ship? I am aware of, GPS spoofing, and these researchers actually taking a ship and spooling it so that it thinks that it's over here, whereas it's actually over here, and that actually happens in the drones as well. You can think about having a drone, landing in an enemy territory, which actually happened. I forgot which country it was, but there was a country that actually captured a US drone and had it land on a different place. So GPS-based spoofing is also, it did apply, I think Georgia Tech, they actually did apply a ship. The thing about taking these, the challenges of actually doing such research is that the system security community is actually heading more and more toward implementation. So it's one thing to actually talk about, we can do it on a ship. It's another thing that we actually did it on a ship.
Okay.
And having access to a ship or to a train is much more difficult than working with a computer, a laptop, or a mobile phone. So that's probably one of the reasons why there's not really a system security publication that actually had access to a ship. Yes, so it may be happening in different sectors, and I would imagine, Navy, pretty much a lot of government sectors that are very actively doing research as well. They may have it. They may probably want to classify it. Yeah.
I think I'd like to comment on some of these things too. These days, a lot of things can go online. Like there is a term called IoT, Internet of Things. So some of the things at your home, like your toaster or your fridge, if you make it sophisticated enough, they can be used to remind you, okay, certain items in your fridge are going to expire and you need to replace those things. And as long as these things come online, they can be hacked. So a few years back, I've seen an example or a case where, in Japan, they have very sophisticated toilets. They have millions of buttons, and then someone took over the toilet and keep flushing. You cannot stop it. So it's the safest thing to do is not to go online, but we can't because it's
Yeah.
There are systems that are not connected to the internet in the sense that they have separate logical connections. And I think that's what happened with these cases as well. They were still using the same networking infrastructure in terms of hardware, but they had a logical separate connection. And there are many systems like that, which people are already seeing that those logical separation can be breached. There are other systems that are more air-gapped. These are completely out of the network. They are not designed for networking, using USB, using floppy disks. For that, if that was the question, I would probably talk about Stuxnet right away. In which case, there are people who are using social engineering to actually the USB type of attack, and after that, people are like, okay, be cautious when you use USBs and so on. Yeah, but different type of systems. I agree. If you're connected and if you're networking, then it does increase the vulnerability space.
I'm curious, since we have a lot of people from healthcare here today, given the HIPAA requirements and the other things and the documentation and the advent of extreme analytics to base on performance and delivery of care, USBs in some facilities are pretty prominent. Yet aren't USBs typically sources of malware from either producers of the USBs or through viral contamination through use in other devices?
Yeah. Well, it's not recommended not to actually use the USB if you don't trust it. So, for example, if you picked it up on a public place, then don't trust it. And I think the eye-opening experience of that was actually Stuxnet. Before that, people really.
So when you go to a trade show and they give you a USB from a pharmaceutical company, you shouldn't use it, right?
Probably not.
Yeah. I was just curious because I'm surprised that you still see people using USBs.
You don't see that too much in the hospitals.
Yeah, it's declining, isn't it?
Yeah, I haven't seen USB in forever, but you might in rule settings or something like that. But
On this campus?
The computer, the computer network is alive and well in healthcare, but that was mandated from the federal government and President Obama back in 2010 to have all medical records electronic by, I think it was 2014. They're still working on it, but And so you take paper and pencil, which granted isn't that secure either, but it's more secure in my opinion than putting it on the internet. So now people, because, people just had their, who got hacked, the credit service? Equifax just got, well, they can hack, your medical records are just hanging there. I mean, if they can get your medical records easy. And there's a thing too, I don't know if you're aware of this, there's a thing in Colorado that happened 2 years ago, I believe, where, and you may have already signed something that you don't know where you were signing, that, let's say you have services here at Penrose Main Hospital, and you get treated for XYZ. And then you're out at Fort Collins doing something else, and you have to be seen by a medical provider. You can sign a form where they can get instant access to your medical records here. So your medical records can now be shared wherever you go, not just within the state, but within the states and outside of you too as well. So your medical records now can be shared all over.
Now, I know, like,
Which is a
emails
convenience.
To do preventative things, right?
Yeah, so it's an email. They marketed it as a convenience. So your medical records are no longer stored at your private physician's office or at the one hospital you've gone to. They can be shared all over the place if you sign the paper.
But there is a problem with different medical systems not interacting with each other.
Yeah,
So
too,
that's
yeah.
a huge issue
Yeah.
where,
Yeah.
Penrose can't talk to Memorial and vice versa.
Mhm.
So, there
Yeah, because
is,
they use different systems, although they're going to the same system now.
so.
Yeah, they just went to the same system as of this
I have
past
a
day.
question. Basically, I'm from the electrical computer engineering side of the house. What I see is there's more and more people building very complicated IC chips and more people that are providing package software of how to interact with their chips. And then you take, 100 of those and you throw those into a system and they all have their own software package provided, their own chip provided. And then you're the person who's trying to figure out how to make that cumulative device, a car, an airplane, or a ship, secure. Do you see that as becoming a problem of having too many vendors with too many different pieces of software, and then everyone's just kind of trying to hack them together in a way to make them work that brings up a lot of vulnerabilities?
Absolutely. More parties getting involved in terms of the supply chain, until it gets manufactured, that increases vulnerability. It's just in general, increased complexity, increases vulnerability. Security works in a way that, if it's working, then nothing happens. If there's one loophole, then the attack, succeeds. Going back to supply chain, it's become a huge issue. And whilst computer security is still predominantly, I would say majority is still computer science. Many of the work is still software-based, but people are starting to look into, hardware-based vulnerability and exploits as well. People are getting really, really nervous with all these IoTs and some of the chips being manufactured in an untrusted, by untrusted vendors, like in a different country. Yes.
What were your students' reactions, or did they find it valuable for the ethics component in the course that you taught? Did you get some feedback from them, or did you get any kind of assessment or survey?
Yes. So there was interaction, and we did have about 5 minutes to actually reflect on it, so that the students actually do talk about, or absorb or understand that case study. The whole case study was, here's the DFEI ethical principles, here's the case study, let's match them. So individually, integrity, rule of law, liability is big, because a lot of these decisions were based on liability. We're making values, for not only the stakeholders or the team members, in this case, NHTSA, GM, and so on, but also to the wide public who's actually riding the vulnerability cars. So So we did go through that exercise, and from the interaction that I got from the students, I was really happy. Because this is it can be a little slightly complicated case. That's why in the class there were actually a few more videos. One being generic, about increasing complexity in computer security space. But the other two videos, I showed the Steven Sabaja's video for like 10 minutes as well. So there was a bit more context building, more interaction. But this is more like a summary of what happened. And I actually want to turn that around and kind of ask you about some of the practice that may help me for my future teaching. If there are any thoughts about maybe I can do this, maybe I can do that.
You said you're doing this now when you're working on their projects,
Mhm.
and this time you did it like early in their project. So you don't know yet the result if their projects are any more focusing on ethical issues. You'll know it at the end of the semester.
It's really difficult to measure that.
Yeah.
I just done it like last year because there were a couple team members were talking to me. Can I do this? I feel nervous about it. These days, it may still happen, but I was hoping that the principal and that actually addresses it, some of those concerns, because I'm pretty sure more than a couple of the teams are feeling that. So it's really hard to actually quantify or measure that. But maybe I should put more thought into actually doing that.
You could actually, when you grade the projects, include the ethical.
Yeah.
That's what we tend to do. If you include it in the gradings, if they've considered ethical issues, then it'll actually be, oh, this is important, and you can maybe see then how they've done it.
Oh, okay. Like have them actually like draft like a paragraph or two about like how they actually practice the project in an ethical manner.
Or what they've done, how it, the disclosure and things like that. We have some examples of some rubrics that we could share with you.
I would think that they can quantify in their paper their critical thinking. I'm doing this, and the impact of this project is from a social impact. If it's just an inconvenience, my refrigerator doesn't work and I lose $300 worth of food, or I cause an accident and the cost of recovery from that accident is X, that they'd actually start to reflect on that these are, I hate the word because it sounds military, but they're weapons that can be used for good or for ill. And if I'm creating a weapon or an intervention, maybe a more pleasant word, then what are the impacts of my intervention? And what are the consequences of my action? I'll give you, my brother-in-law has a MyQ, which is a garage door opener system, right? And I can open his garage and I can do his temperature because his router is 1111. I won't give you his name so you can't mess with it. But he calls me up and says, can you fix my problem? And I said, well, sure. Because all I have to do is log in. Now, there's a lot of damage you could do shutting off a heating system, so I would think that there's either a social implication or a financial implication that they could calculate that might give them an incentive, building on what you're saying,
to make sure it's
reflect on it.
incorporated.
Yeah, think about it.
I think that's excellent. I do have a report as part of the project, so definitely consider that. Thanks for that.
Yeah, dovetailing off of what he said, I think, because I don't have an idea how, but if you could think about how you could, because in today's generation, in the, whatever you call them now, the people,
Which
They were
one?
millennials.
I don't know what they are,
are.
really, I bet they're Generation Z. I think that's what they call them.
Yeah.
But anyway, that group
Generation
and millennials, they're so immersed in the game world that these kinds of things can appear as a game. And so if it has a social impact, like death or whatever, it's not really real to them because it's like a game. And so if you can somehow make it real, that it is real, it's not a game, that may cause them to pause and consider the ethics of what they're doing.
The other thing
Implications beyond that.
I love the idea of putting it in the report, but, and you alluded to it, but I think you need to turn up the volume a little bit. I mean, you're obviously really plugged into how the ethical dilemma of the whole cybersecurity area is really important, okay? And your students need to leave your classes with that same feeling. So anything you can do to instill that, and it's a challenge. I mean, even within our business students, we have trouble doing that. And I are an engineer in the past, and I know that that's even harder in engineering areas. So you know, trying to get that that point across to the point where they begin to live that as part of what they do. You know, anything you can do to do that as part of this class is
Okay.
Good job.
Like, I got a class coming up.
Yeah.
Now I gotta start thinking.
Yeah.
As part of a report,
I'm
indications are
really
great.
impressed with your before and after.
Yeah.
The before and after post, because that used to be what it was always ethics was the last class.
Tag on.
And if there was a snow day, you just didn't get to it. Thank you.
Well, two really good things.